Welcome and thank you so much for being here. I think it was in 2009 that a few of us led an effort of friends and family to create a monument for President Bush, which was an anchor on Ocean Avenue. And 2 years later, we also created a garden, Ganny's Garden, just down the road on Ocean Avenue. And the reason we did that was both historical, the fact that having a president that's a part of your town for so many years was something special. And Ken Rayner and Nancy Sosa and I helped lead that effort. But we saw it as a local type thing, most of all. And we thought it was important for not only the historical reason, but it was special because we had never met anyone that loved Kennebunkport more than President and Mrs. Bush did. And so having it there was a place that we could go to remember those days, remember the wonderful things they did for the town and how they were part of this community. And we had the good fortune of, and the honor, of being able to attend Mrs. Bush's funeral. And when Reverend Levenson started his remarks, his first words were about Ganny's Garden in Kennebunkport, in a very peaceful place. And all of a sudden we thought this local effort has now hit an international stage, and it was really quite astounding. And we're delighted tonight to have Reverend Levenson here to talk about his new book, Labor of Love, and from a very unique and special perspective.
So this is Tom Bradbury, if you don't know. I think you probably do. My name is Mary Lou Bucavalis. I work here at the Graves Library. Can I just see a show of hands of anybody here for the first time ever? Don't be shy. It's okay. Welcome. So we always love to see new faces, and we hope we can see you again. We are here tonight to hear about our favorite Maine couple. We are so thrilled that you were here, and thank you for getting the ball rolling on this. So I'm just going to say a little bit about you. Is that okay?
Sure.
Okay.
Just keep it short. It's
One paragraph.
Okay, good.
So, Reverend Levenson and his wife Laura live in Houston, Texas, where he has served as rector of St. Martin's Episcopal Church since 2007. With nearly 10,000 members, St. Martin's is the largest Episcopal church in North America. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Reverend Levenson co-officiated and offered a homily at the state funeral for President George H.W. Bush in Washington, D.C. and in Houston, and also officiated and preached at the funeral for First Lady Barbara Bush in Houston. President and Mrs. Bush belonged to and were active members of St. Martin's for more than 50 years. So we are so excited that you are joining us tonight. One little piece of housekeeping, if you could remember to silence your cell phones. So as my priest says to me when I'm in church, if your phone rings, it better be God. So anyway, welcome everyone. Welcome Reverend.
Thank you. Thank you. It often happens in church, and I'll stop the sermon usually, and I will say, "Is that God?" And if it's God, then maybe He's correcting me. So, I want to thank you for having me and having Laura. My wife Laura is here tonight, and we've been coming to your lovely village at the invitation of the president and Bar and the family since 2008. And some of you have read the book, know about some of the adventures that we've had here. But this has become a very special place to us, not just because of how wonderful you are, how wonderful this place is. It's very different from Houston, Texas. Let's just start with the temperature. 112 the day we left in Houston. So we may not go back. And when you say 10,000 members, all that sounds like to me is exhausting. So it's great to be here. My wife and I actually got to go to one of the beaches yesterday. I really do want to thank Tom Bradbury and Mary Lou Bucavalis. I've been practicing how to say her name right. But for this invitation, because You don't know me, but we know you. And I think people like Tom and Mary Lou, who not only love your village, but preserve the village and its history and its memories and its importance, are the kind of people you need in your community. So a real word of thanks to Tom, Mary Lou, and those who do that. So I thought I'd start with a joke. I might as well. To let you know, President and Mrs. Bush had a great sense of humor. I will start. I did a talk in Houston with gratitude at the invitation of my friend, my brother by another mother, Neil Bush, who's here tonight, at the literacy event in April of this year. And it was a great event, and they do such great work in the city of Houston and beyond for literacy. But there were about 1,600 people, I think is what we counted that night. And I kind of looked out on the crowd, mostly Houstonians, but many people from other places, and I said, how many of you met President or Mrs. Bush? And roughly half the room, And I said, because I like to do this, I said, but how many of you have a story about President and Mrs. Bush? Because you usually didn't just meet them. There was usually a story that went with them. So I would ask you, how many of you met President or Mrs. Bush? I bet, right. And so how many of you have a story? So yeah, most everybody. And the story is everything from, it's Taco Sunday at the house, why don't you come join us, to, in Houston, we would see Barbara at Walgreens pushing her cart, and she might stop a patron and pull down, Esther C. and go, have you ever tried this? And so there are these Moses, Jesus, and this other guy are out playing golf. And it's a short hole. It's a three par. And so Moses gets up to the tee, but there's a big lake between the tee and the green. Moses gets up, hits his ball, goes out, lands in the water, sinks. Moses goes, no problem, walks down to the water, takes his driver, lays it at the edge. The water divides up on either side. Moses goes down, chips his ball up onto the green, boom, in the cup. And Jesus and the other guy go, that's wonderful. Jesus gets up to the tee, same problem, hits the ball, goes out, going up, headed right toward the lake, hits the lake, but doesn't sink, rolls, and stays on the top. So Jesus walks down onto the water, chips it up onto the green, into the cup. The other two go. Third guy gets up, hits the ball, it's going up, down toward the water feature. And just as it's about to go into the water feature, a largemouth bass comes up, swallows the ball. Just before the bass goes back in the water, an eagle flies down, grabs the bass, picks it up, flies over the hole, drops the bass. Ball pops out. And Jesus goes, nice shot, Dad. I tell you that because the president loved that joke. And my goal is to get the ball in the cup for you tonight. So you feel like your time was not wasted tonight. I'd like to do about three things. I'd like to talk a little bit about why I wrote this book, and then I'd like to show you a PowerPoint that I'll go through rather quickly. Some of the photos I'll skip over because they're more Houston or St. Martin's friendly. And then I'd like to read a little bit. And then if you have Q&A, happy to do that. But again, as I've said to several of you, probably many of you can tell me stories I've not heard. But my intent in putting this book together was to tell you stories that you might not have heard. There are lots of things written about the president and Barbara, and as I've shared with many people, in the first conversation with Barbara, they were actually here in Maine, and I had to call them about a church matter, and I called the house over at Walker's Point, and they both put me on speaker. And this is the first time I had had much any interaction with them, really. And I said, President and Mrs. Bush, and Barr immediately said, nope, Mrs. Bush is my mother-in-law. You can call me Barbara or Barr, but do not call me Mrs. Bush. And I said, okay. It was very hard to do. And the president never told me not to call him Mr. President. So I always, Always did that. So odd to be out fishing in the North Atlantic, Mr. President. But I did not have in mind to write a book. I will share that with you. I did not. We began our journey at St. Martin's in Houston in 2007, and I served that parish and the family until the time of their deaths in 2018. I wasn't taking notes. I didn't put things down. And in fact, if you've read the book, you'll know many times in the book I said, "What are we doing here?" I would ask myself, "How did we get here? How do we kind of land in this?" So many places that the President and Bar invited us into that we never thought we would be in the early part of our ministry. And I think in the end, and I think I say this in the book, in the end I think I was there by the grace of God, and I was there to tell you these stories. Because there's a lot written, of course, about his leadership and their life and the public eye, but there was not, I think, a lot written about their faith journey. And so that's what I wanted to share, is their priest and pastor, being with them for a time in which, when we met, they were very healthy. But in the years that followed, we were able to kind of observe and witness, which is the reason for the title, two people that we came to learn lived with dignity and served with dignity, loved with dignity, aged with dignity, and died with dignity. And that's a story I felt like perhaps now as much as any time in a generation, if not more than a generation, that we might need to hear again. And so probably 2 years after their deaths and after reflecting on all that we were able to observe, I started to kind of put this together in my head. Maybe this story needs to be told. And of course I was looking at the political landscape that we were all living through, a very divisive time in our country, I think it's fair to say, that has not really shifted a whole lot. But I felt like, well, let me kind of float the idea. And the children, Neil and Dura, and the others were very kind to entertain an early question. I said, would y'all be okay if I wrote a book about this? And they said, yes, but of course we want to see whatever you write. And I actually kind of put the idea away for a while because I couldn't quite figure out how I was going to do it. One of the reasons I had trouble is, those of you who know the President Bar also know they were very self-effacing, didn't like the attention on them, and I struggled for a long time about writing a book that I didn't use a lot of personal pronouns. Because the only way I could tell this story was to tell it through my own eyes. And so when we kind of got close to writing or putting the idea together, I actually wrote the children one more time. And I said, so here's what I'm thinking about doing. Are you all okay with that? And they all said yes. Again, we just would like to see what you do. And I said, the only problem I'm having is I feel like I'm going to keep talking about myself, and I don't want it to be about myself. I want it to be about the President and Bar. And Jeb actually wrote back and said, well, that's the only way you can tell that story. So tell the story. In other words, get on with it. And at that point I said, okay, would you write the foreword? And he said yes. And I thought, I don't think he ever thought I'd really write the book. So after I got through writing the book and had a deal, I called him on the phone. I said, so I've written the book. You going to write the foreword? And he said, how long does it have to be? So that's a whole other discussion. But as it kind of began to gel, I wrote the book with a publisher called Hachette, and they've done a lot of stuff for a lot of different people. And they gave me 30 days to write it because they wanted it to come out right before December of last year. And so my wife is here, and I affectionately went into my wife and I said, goodbye, because I have a day job. And so I wrote the book in the daytime, and I did my work for St. Martin's at night. So, and I did it in 30 days. It was 200 pages longer than the one you're holding. And I said to the editor, is that okay? And they said, oh, we'll take care of it. We'll get it down. So they bumped 200 pages. But chapter 18 is a chapter in which I reflect on the time in which we're living in contrast to the kind of leadership and dignity that President modeled for us during his years as vice president, as president, in so many other ways. And I do finish saying I hope that invites us to a deeper place of responsibility when it comes to our own civic responsibility to what needs to happen in our nation today. But I will say, I got through with that, and I thought, that's kind of a downer. I kind of said to my wife, I said, I do want people to think about that, but I'd like to end on kind of an up note. And so the last chapter I wrote about what Christians believe about life after death. And because that was a big part of the discussions I had with Barbara and the president toward the end. And I said, and I want to tell this too, because the president and Barbara very much believed in life after death and believed that they would be together again. And so I hope I ended, on a good note. So the goal was to honor them. This is a labor of love and admiration, to honor really their faith, to honor the Christian faith. And as you know, the president and Barbara were very open and inclusive. You'll see in many places in the book, we're very intentional about including people of all faiths in a lot of the things that we did when we gathered at St. Martin's. But the president and Barbara were Christians, and I wanted to honor that faith. And then I wanted to give you some sense of changing the conversation about where we are now. And not just look at things, and when we grab that word nostalgia, we often think, oh, nostalgia is just thinking about the good old days, and those will never come back. But sometimes nostalgia can make you, want the good old days. And I think a lot of us want those. One of the things I've told, and it's not in the book, I've told this in some of the talks I've given. One of the other very active members of our church and a good friend of the president is James A. Baker III, the former Secretary of State, still very active, 93 years old. Extraordinary, I know, because my wife and I go hunting with him. If you're an anti-hunter, don't talk to me afterwards, because it's just you go. If he asks you to go, you go. And my wife's better at it than I am. So, but I said, I want to check this story because I think it talks about what we're all kind of hungering for. And I confirmed this story. And some of you know the story, but I asked Jim if this was true. So some of you remember after President Reagan was shot and was recovering in the hospital after the assassination attempt, that after the family had visited and there was one aide in the room with the president. Of course, Secret Service outside, but there was one aide in the room with him. And I can't remember the guy's name. You could Google it because it's several people have repeated the story. I asked Jim Baker, I said, is this lore or did this really happen? And I asked him, and he said, no, this really happened. So do any of you remember the first person, public figure, who visited the president other than his family after he was coming out? Any of you remember who it was? Tip O'Neill, Democratic Speaker of the House. He walked in the room. He acknowledged the aide. He walked over to President Reagan. He knelt down. He recited the 23rd Psalm. He prayed with him. He stood up, kissed him on the forehead, said, I'm going to let you recover, Mr. President, and he left the room. So where are those days? And I don't think they're gone forever. I think we have an opportunity to bring them back. But one of the reasons I wrote this book is to remind people that there was a time when that's the way we behaved. And it is a time that we need to return to. So I think one of the things that is a common theme throughout the book is that I do believe very firmly, how many of you are Episcopalians? So a lot of you are Episcopalian, members of the Episcopal Church. We are often called the frozen chosen. We kind of live our faith, but we don't necessarily wear it on our sleeves, but it's a very important part of who we are. And I think that's true of the president. But I do think when he was shot down in September of 1944, as a 19-year-old airman, and we came up bobbing out of the water, and the USS Finback comes along and picks him out of the water. Some of you will remember that the question he was asking at that moment, now think about most 19-year-olds right now. They'd be taking selfies of themselves as they floated in the water. The president did not say, well, thank God, or I'm going to go party, or what. He started asking, why did God spare me? And I do think that became a plumb line for the president. Why did God spare me at this moment in history? And, there are things people know, and there are things people perhaps don't know. I love the story and I recount this in the book, on VE Day, when the war is over, and the president hurried back to the States to recover and to marry Barr. And he did not know if he was going to be called back into service, of course. But VE Day occurs when he happens to be home. And so everybody breaks out into the street to celebrate, and I'm sure Barr and the president did their own celebration. But the first thing they did was go find a church in which they offered privately their prayers of thanksgiving for the end of the war. When Robin was battling and ultimately succumbed to cancer, leukemia, President and Barr were in Texas, and the president stopped every day at 6:30 a.m. to pray privately at the church where they were attending for his daughter. When Robin did die, Barr would say one of the most intensely spiritual moments in her life, that one of the moments when she felt the closest to God, was sitting there with her daughter after her death and combing her hair. She felt the presence of God. And so I think those kinds of things really did inform the man you and I came to know. Many of you here came to know him personally, and the world came to know him publicly. You know, when he and others made the decision to go into Kuwait, you know, a lot of people were trying to tell him how to do that. One of the things that he and Jim Baker did was closely study the Augustinian just war theory. Any of you who know anything about that, we studied that in seminary. But they not only looked at what the Red Cross had to say and human rights groups had to say, but they studied the just war theory developed by St. Augustine to determine, is this not just something we do, is it the right thing to do? Whether or not you agreed with the decision, that's how they went about it. And they sought the counsel of clergy and others. So as he left office and came back to Houston, I did not know we would become the friends. In fact, I'll be honest with you, I didn't know if they were going to be what we in the Episcopal Church call Creasters, which are Christmas and Easter Christians. They come twice a year, or would they come every week? And what we found was, shortly after they came, is that they came every week. Laura and I were moving from Pensacola, Florida. That's east of the Mississippi, and we lived on the coast. We were very happy, basically, where we were. All of our family was east of the Mississippi. We had nobody west of the Mississippi in the way of family, and very few friends. And so when the call came, and it became very evident to us that it was a call from our Lord, and we responded with a yes. Somehow, the president got wind that this was going to be difficult for us, because we were literally leaving friends, family, and we were on the coast, you know, and it was going to be, going to Houston, not the coast. And one day I was leaving the house, and the phone rang, and I saw Office of President George H.W. Bush, and I will tell you it was a pastoral emergency. And so I was like, do I take that call, or do I go? This person, they'll be okay. So I took the call, and he welcomed us, and he was very sweet, and we look forward to meeting you. And about 2 weeks later, all four of our parents were alive at the time. Now we're down just to my father, who's 84, last man standing. But about 2 weeks later, the president, as he's done, I'm sure, with many of you, hand wrote a letter to both sets of parents, about a page and a half, saying, I know this is very difficult for you to let your children go. I just want you to know we look forward to meeting you and taking care of you, et cetera. And we look forward to, and we're going to take care of Russ and Laura. And they did. And so we soon learned in the fall of 2007 they were not going to be Creasters. They were in church every week unless they were traveling or unless they were sick. Every week. And I think one of the things I like to tell my members is that it's really important to keep in mind that when I met the president in 2007, as you all know, he was a big man. He was tall and had no mobility issues, no cane or anything like that. Same with Barbara. She wasn't very tall, but she was, no mobility issues. But as the years increased, he went to a cane, he went to a walker, he went to a wheelchair, and he did not let those things stop him from worshiping his Lord with his fellow Christians. Barr went from walking to, she had one of those hurricanes. She loved to brag about it because it moved a lot, to the walker, and she did not let those things keep her from coming to church. And in fact, she would, and the only reason I know this is because one Sunday my wife happened to be in church. Laura didn't sit with them very often. No, they had their spot, like most Episcopalians do. And But Barb would come into church and she would take a prayer book out and put it behind her back because she was suffering with sciatica toward the end. But she didn't want to get up and leave church because of whatever she was feeling, especially during what she would sometimes point out as my long sermons she endured. So occasionally I got a note or an email on those kinds of things. And so we spent a lot of time. I love their humor, and I'll talk a little bit about that as I go through the PowerPoint. But I will just say that a big part of our life those last few years was being with them very often, and having wonderful, general, sweet talks about life after death and what all that meant and what all that looked like. They were very much at peace, and it was probably one of the greatest privileges of my life to be with both of them when they left this life for the next. Because they died the way all of us want to die. They died at peace, and they died surrounded by friends and family and loved ones, and knowing confidently where they were going. And then the funerals really, for Episcopalians, they were pretty much Episcopal funerals, aside from who came, right? But the president and bar did not, they wanted, for those of you who are Episcopalian, they wanted prayer book funerals. So that's what they got. And we spent a lot of time, there's a lot of pomp and circumstance that goes with a state funeral that went with Bar. In fact, Bar's funeral, she really did not believe people. She kept saying, who's going to come? And Dora and Neil will remember, we had this moment where we decided part of this needs to be a visitation in Houston. And she said, oh, God. And she kept saying, I don't want to be, can you not just put me in the chapel and have people walk by? And I said, no, it requires a lot more than that. And so the staff and the children and the priest, we eventually convinced her a visitation was important. And what was it she said, Laura? We were talking about it as we came in. We were up here, and Barbara said something like, evidently. Right. Apparently I'm a very important person. And so I've got to do this. We had over 8,000 people come through her visitation at St. Martin's in Houston. And then after the services, the gift they gave through those services was inspiring other people to think about life in a different way. And so I got letters from all over, not all over the country, all over the world, for people who wrote me about that service, and they wanted to know, where can you find that service? I said, well, we Episcopalians, we have something called the prayer book. Let's start there. But I had stories about people who went back to church after watching that service. I had a story from a young man who said, I had thought for years about going to seminary and I had put it off. I watched the service. I'm now enrolled in my first year of seminary. Those kinds of things. And I personally wrote every single person who wrote me that because somebody told me, you better do that, because the president used to do that all the time. Well, let me do a quick PowerPoint. I'm mindful of your time. And so, as I said, I won't go through all of these, but some have humor and some are just really great storytellers. So this first picture, there is a little funny story with it. And so this was a photograph outside of old St. Martin's. So St. Martin's has been through, we're a young church. We're only 71 years old, started in 1952. I'm only the fourth rector. Those of you who know, rector means senior pastor. So this is many years ago, and after Barbara's death, or actually she was getting close to death, I reached out to the family and I said, this is a lovely photograph, and we had it in our church archives. I said, can we include it in the bulletin? And all the kids, adult kids, said yes, please do. And I thought it's just a great thing to include, but I said, when I can identify Barbara and George, the president, and Big George, the other president, and Doro. But I said, it's hard to identify who's who among these. And there's one hidden. And so I sent that out as an email to all the children. I said, I can see, George 41, George 43, Barbara and Doro. I said, but one kid is hidden behind one of the brothers. And this is all in an email, and it's in the book. And so we get to the end, and Dora said, oh, of course you can use that. And I said, okay, well, but who's the one hidden? And I think it was Dora or Neil said, oh, that's Jeb. He's behind his brother. And Jeb, right at the end, goes, story of my life. And so the president loved to show off his church. And so one Sunday, the second rector of St. Martin's, Claude Payne, had a Bring a Friend to Church Sunday. And so the president brought Margaret Thatcher. And so you can imagine the members of St. Martin's and how they felt about that. So the president, as I said, Barbara, were very active in lots of ways. They didn't just come sit in the pews. They, the president would serve coffee. He ushered. He served on our vestry. Barr would come and sit with a group called the Saintly Stitchers. We have a lot of pews, as you can imagine, at St. Martin's, and all the pews have kneelers, and they're all hand-stitched by a group of women. And Barr stitched 3 of those, and the last of which she was stitching toward the end of her life. And I would come visit her, and sometimes I'd see her at the hospital or at home, and she'd be working on one, and I'd walk in, and she'd go, "I'm not doing this just because you're walking in here right now." So she said, "I really am doing this." This next photograph is, to me, again, a telltale sign of the way in which we ought to live and the way in which we need to return to. And when the president was vice president and running for the first time as president, he did quite well in that first election. But he called the second rector, Claude Payne at the time, who was in a women's guild meeting at the church, and said, can I speak to the rector? So the rector comes out, and the president, and this is the way the story, I called Claude, who's still alive. I said, "Can you confirm this story to me?" He said, "Absolutely." And he said, the president called about a week before the election and said, "You know, Claude, the election's next week, next Tuesday. I think our chances are pretty good," which they were, if you remember. He said, "But you know, whatever happens, the next morning, can we have a worship service at St. Martin's Wednesday morning? And if I win, it'll be a service of celebration. And if I lose, it'll be a service in which we pray for the person who has been elected president." And so this is that service. And again, would we return to those days? Here's Barr holding up one of the Saintly Stitchers projects. They did a nativity scene that she took to the White House. At the time, there were 200 Saintly Stitchers. Now we're down to a precious few now. But she invited them all up to the White House for an Advent coffee. And so that's the kind of thing they did. The only thing I'll do here is, not that you need to see my family, but this again told me so much about the two of them. When you bring a new rector on, you're instituted, you're installed. Installed sounds like air conditioning unit. Instituted sounds better. So I was instituted on January 6th in 2008. And we're taking photographs, and there's my wife's late mother, my father on the far right, my 3 kids, President Barr. And that day, it's a big service, a long service, 2 hours, and then we had a big reception afterwards and photographs. And in the middle of all this, I realized that it was the President and Barr's anniversary that I had planned. And I felt horrible that we had planned this big event, and they were going to participate, and here we are. And so we're breaking up after this photograph. And I looked at Barr and I said, "Barr, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize this was your wedding anniversary. Please, you all feel free to go out and do something." She looked at me and she said, "We've had a few." And she said, but then she said, "But you know, this is where we want to be, is supporting our priest and our rector." So again, okay, one of my favorite stories. I'll make it brief. How many of you met BB, the dog, the white Maltipoo? Raise your hand high. How many of you were bit by BB? Yeah, almost everybody who got close to BB was bit, and including my wife. So we were over the house one day, brought communion to the president because he wasn't able to make it. And so by then we were very close relationship with the president, Barr, and we always they were very affectionate. "I love you." And one of my favorite things he used to say, you say, "I love you," you say, "Love you more." And but Laura usually would kiss him on the cheek, and she leaned down to kiss him on the cheek, and BB bit my wife. And Barr, at first, she said, "Oh, I feel horrible about that." And in the years that followed, Barbara just said, "Well, that's what she does." But in the early years, when the dog was biting people, she would apologize, and it was a bleeding wound. Let's put it that way. We walked out of the house. Barbara felt horrible about it. We walked out of the house. I looked at my wife. I said, "You just got bit by the first dog." And so we went outside, and the next day, my wife was coming back from one of her volunteer activities in the city, and she saw a car pulling away, and she got in the house, and probably limping from the day before, and opened the door, and it was an orchid with this note: "Please forgive me, you look good enough to eat. Love, B.B. Bush." Which is great. This is the kind of stuff the president and Barr would do that would drive the Secret Service crazy. And if the youth, the teens were out doing something at the church in the parking lot, president would just amble over and sit in the middle of them. And you're around teenagers, for God's sake. What might happen? And then we have the Houston Marathon that used to come by the church. It doesn't come by the church anymore. But Barr and the president would come out of church, so they go right out to the street and start shaking hands with anybody who came by. And of course, the Secret Service is always around them, very active. There's their friends, Jim and Susan Baker, and Jim and Susan have been as supportive as the president and Barr have on almost everything. Wonderful day when we recognized the president and Barr for all the service they had rendered to so many people. And the reason I include this is that it was such a sweet moment. The president looked at me. We had recognized him with something we call the Star Award. And he said, "Can I have the microphone? I want to say something." Absolutely. And I'm handing him the microphone, and he tries to say it, and he tears up, and he can't get it out. And he said, "I just love my church so much." And a week later, he sent me a letter of apology for crying. And I said, "Please don't, you were modeling the kind of behavior you should model." Here's a great event that was inspired by my friend Neil Bush. We had the anniversary of the Points of Light Foundation, and that does so much good work around the nation and the world. And it had never met in Houston. And so the year that it met in Houston, the president and Neil reached out and asked if we could have a church service, because we had never done a church service before. And so I was working very closely with two friends I had worked with before, Rabbi David Lyon and Imam Wazir Ali, and John Meacham came to preach. As soon as the other religious leaders in town got wind of this service, they all wanted to participate. So we had to have the conservative Jew and the progressive Jew, and the conservative Muslim and the progressive Muslim. We had two Buddhist priestesses. Everybody came, but I looked at them all and said, "Nobody preaches. We can't preach. We're only going to have an offering." And so John Meacham gave a great address, and we raised some money for the foundation. Here's a great photo of Barr and some family members. That's a long story. And then we did get this one visit. And if you want to hear the funny stories behind that, I'll do it later in the Q&A, but I'll just pass by. Here's our first trip to Kennebunkport, which we remember. There's my kids. They're all grown up now and working. so all out of the house and grown up. But this was just a wonderful time, as you'll hear me say in my readings in just a moment. And of course, this is where we got to really get to know Barr and the president, but mostly Barr. A lot of walks on the beach, and this one day, Barr and I were coming up from the beach, and this guy comes up. Might have been one of you, I don't know, but he comes up as we're finishing. He goes, "You look a lot like Barbara Bush." And Barr said, "I hear that." And he took like 2 steps past us, and he figured it out, and he was horrified. And I include this just because it's one of my favorite pictures, and this was at some church event out front. Now, of course, we come to Barr's funeral, and it was such a touching moment. It was a moment when America came together. I don't know how many of you watched the service. I hope most of you did. It's online if you haven't watched it. This is Evan Sisley, who was the medical aide, who really we worked in tandem the last weeks of both of their lives. We would talk several times a day, but of course, 43 and 41 coming in together. We had a big reception in our parish hall, and it just gives you a chance to see how loved he is, how loved they were by so many people. These are the socks he wore. So there's his good friend Jim Baker. There's Susan. And there's Neil in the background, Brent Scowcroft, John Major, Brian Mulrooney, really good close friends, Dan Quayle. And these two guys, who would have ever guessed? They became the friends they were, but they were. And then we're circling up. And by the way, if you're ever considering ministry, I'm looking at anybody that's younger than maybe you. So anybody else younger? So if you're considering a life, they don't teach you that you might be addressing former presidents and first ladies in seminary. That's OTJ. It's on-the-job training. But we circle up to kind of go through the service. And then I said, you know, we're in Texas, and in Texas we're close, and so let's hold hands. So we all held hands right before we went into the service and prayed together. So, and then this is just a great photo, you know, to see all these folks together. And I said, for 2 hours, everybody got along. And it was a beautiful moment. Lots of people participating in the service, granddaughters reading in the service. Again, all these folks singing together here at St. Martin's. Jeb spoke. This is after the service. And one of the things I wanted people to see is, you know, I know how much they were loved here. I know how much you people of Kennebunkport love them. And they are just as loved in Texas. And so as we left, everybody in our state helped. And from the policeman, and as we left, there's about a 90-mile journey from St. Martin's to the burial spot at College Station. And I'm telling you, from St. Martin's in Houston all the way to College Station, this is what we saw. And I want you to remember that welcome home, Barbara, because of something I'll read to you in just a moment. All the way. I love this one, this young lady out here. And then, of course, just a few months later, this was the spring, and we get to the fall, and the president starts to decline and passes away. And yet that was a powerful, tender moment, and to be with him in that moment, dying at peace, which is where we all want to be. And then this is, some of you know about Sully. So I will say, for a while there, we didn't know what happened to BB. She just disappeared after Barbara, and all of a sudden Sully appeared. And Sully was nice. Sully didn't bite anybody. And so Sully was a sweet dog. In fact, this is on Air Force One, but when we went up, Sully came and sat at our feet all the way up to D.C., my wife and I. And I talk about this moment in the book a little bit. Jim Baker came by to talk and with my wife Laura, and I talk a little bit about this discussion in the book where we talk about the way things were and the way things are. They don't teach you how to do interviews in seminary, but I did a number of those from Fox to CNN to CBS to talk to a lot of people. And those days are over. My life in the limelight are over, but it was great to have those opportunities and to discuss matters of faith. I would not get into politics. I chose not to do that. So it gave me the opportunity to talk about our faith and the president's faith and Bar's faith. So here's his service, an incredible moment. 3,800 people attended the service. 17.5 million people watched worldwide. And just there are lots and lots of beautiful. I could have gone on and on. When the publisher told me I could only share 20 photos in the book, I said, I have hundreds of it. They said 20. And I said, I'm going to send you 100. And then and they said, okay, 25. So they bumped it up by 5. I did get a fist bump as I was leaving. I didn't know I was going to get that. But if you get a fist bump, you take it. So there were 13 moments like this. Those of you in the military, ruffles and flourishes, 13 opportunities where we stopped and had special military honors at every space where we stopped. And then coming into the church, these are some of you remember Peter Cheney. And I made the decision early on to invite Peter to be part of that service because it's a big part of President's life. I did not invite the Oak Ridge Boys or Reba McEntire, but they came anyway. And she was lovely, I have to say. And she sang and did a great job. So did Schwarzenegger. He came. He did not sing, and he wasn't lovely. But he's short. I didn't know that. So he's a short guy. But came to the service, and my young clergy just about had a stroke. So then, of course, we went up to the train and made our way. Now, again, going down to College Station. I mean, I hope yours is that. We were leaving D.C., leaving the National Cathedral, and weaving through the streets of D.C. to go to Andrews Air Force Base. And the people, Laura and I were in the car with Secret Service, and they were saying, God, look at all these people. I said, have you been to Texas? And they all said, no. I said, just wait till you get to Texas and see what happened. And it was remarkable in D.C., but when you got to Texas, this is every overpass Every road look at the people along the way. This is coming into College Station. All the people waiting that day. As we rode by in the train, all the way, people in fields, people, just the admiration. Look at this. And then this next picture. We were all trying to do our best to not get choked up, just because you could have done that all day, and honestly. So we're doing a lot of conversation. And then we turned onto what's called Barbara Bush Drive to head toward the burial place. And there were these 300 cadets, men and women, who had been there for 3 hours that day, waiting in the rain. And when we turned the corner and saw that, nobody could speak. And then this is a walk down toward the burial site. If you've not been there, I encourage you to go. You can go. Of course, the library is extraordinary. What the president accomplished in those 4 years, as Jim Baker would say, the most accomplished one-term president in the history of the United States. And it's all displayed there wonderfully. But that's our last walk with the family. Although I do include this because we were all younger, and I like that picture. So some of you have been out to Walker's Point, and you know that. So that's right at the house, the president's motto. So are we okay on time? Is everybody, if you're getting sleepy, just don't drink. My wife just said 5 more minutes. Come on. Let me read a little bit about my impressions of your village, and then you can straighten me out afterwards. I was given a sermon about a month or two ago, and I made a quote about Elvis Presley and what was said to him when and I was in Nashville. I was a guest preacher in Nashville. And I said, and so-and-so said so-and-so to Elvis Presley, and it was because at first they thought he didn't have much talent. And in between services, this guy came up and said, because I'm in Nashville, he goes, that actually was my cousin, and he didn't say that. So I was like, okay, all right, I'll correct it before the next service. But you can't correct what I'm going to say here. So I love this. This is in May of 2010. The president for a long time, and Barr too, were very good at emailing. And so this is just a little email that I got from him. I can't remember in response to, but I included it. He said, we are in very cold Maine, as I type, and happy to be in our own special Shangri-La. Love to all, GB. So the first time we went, I'm just going to give you a couple of things I wrote about your village, and I hope it honors you as was the intent. To the world beyond its grounds, this is Walker's Point, it's been a gathering place for the two presidents who spent their summers there, and leaders from around the globe, including British Prime Ministers Margaret Thatcher and John Major, Russian leaders Mikhail Gorbachev and Vladimir Putin, Canadian Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, and Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. The president and Barr pushed back against calling it the Summer White House and actually refused certain security measures like chain link fencing and bulletproof glass. It's well protected, of course, by Secret Service members who have both offices and private quarters on the property, but this was and is a home. And far be it from Russ and Laura to ever think we would ever have been guests there on several occasions. But in time, it became a beautiful respite, a vacation spot for our entire family, a memory maker, a counseling center, a prayer retreat, in many ways a place of reflection and worship. It was clearly where the president felt very much alive. He loved to play tennis and horseshoes here. He loved to fish and push Fidelity, the fifth of 5 of his boats christened Fidelity, a Fountain 38 with 3 300-horsepower Mercury Verado outboards to its upper limits, 75 miles an hour at full throttle. Barr loved to garden there, both flowers and vegetables. She loved to walk the nearby beaches with friends, family, and pups. When in Kennebunkport, the Bushes were as faithful in their worship as they were in Houston, attending week to week at nearby St. Anne's Episcopal Church. The beautiful structure, which was built in the late 1800s, much like Walker's Point, offers impressive views of the rocks and waves of the Atlantic. In my experience, true hospitality is a gift of God's Spirit. There are those who, by virtue of this gift, open their homes and their dinner tables and their playgrounds to virtually anyone who comes their way. It comes easy for some. It seemed to come easy for the president and Barr, which we observed every time we visited. I can only assume that most of you reading, as I thought, that Walker's Point would be an over-the-top, pristinely decorated with beautiful furniture that was not made for child's play, exquisite woodwork, and stone flooring. This was not the case. Yes, it sits on what is arguably one of the most beautiful pieces of property in the United States. But homes are built and decorated simply, perhaps modestly is a better word. This is not a show place, and it's not a museum. This is a home, a beating heart for the Bush family. Walking through the doors of the main house or any of the other bungalows on the property is actually like walking into the open arms of hospitality. Walking between the bungalow, which of course is the house across from the big house, and the main house was in and of itself moving. The wind is whipping, and even 50 yards away, the waves crashing against the large boulders offered a resounding, repetitive beat like that of a heart. It's hard to dismiss the metaphor. All right, so I'll close with one piece, and then I want to read one more thing in which I recommend people come to Kennebunkport. Although not as many as today, goodness gracious, there were a lot of people crammed in today. So I do want to share this because, and sadly, I hate to put mainly Neil through this because he's heard it a few times, and my wife many times more. But I want to say a little bit about Barr's last day. There's a similar write-up about the president's last day, but it was a really powerful experience. I've been with several people when they leave this life for the next, but the way Barr did it's the way I hope I do it, courageously and peacefully and beautifully, and even humor kind of right at the end. So a few days before, in fact, we were talking about this at the house at Walker's Point yesterday. A few days before Barr passed away, we thought she was passing away. And I was called, we live not far from the president's house and the church. They were very close to the church. You could walk to either one. And so got a call and came over to the house, and Neil and Dora were there and other members of the family, the president's chief of staff. And Dora came walking downstairs and said, "Mom's resting." And I said, does she want me to go up and pray with her? And Dora said, "Let me go check." I remember all this like it was yesterday, but 5 years ago. And Dora went up and came back down. And she said, "Mom wants you to stay with Dad." And the president goes, "I want you to go pray with her." And I said, "Yes, sir." So I went upstairs and I knocked on the door. And I said, "Barr," and all she said was, "I'm not checking out yet." And I said, "Okay." I said, "But your husband said, can I come in and talk with you, and he wants me to be with you for a moment." And so we talked for a little bit, and I said, "Now, let's pray." And I anointed her head with oil, and we prayed, and I gave her a little kiss before I went out of the room. And I was pulling the door to, and Barr called out and said, and I heard her all I heard was say something. And so I opened the door and stepped back in, and she, I said, "Are you okay, Barr?" And she said, "Yes, just tell him I adore him." So I go back downstairs, and we're all weepy, I have to say. We were all weepy that night, and the president's kind of weepy, and he said, did she have anything to say? I said, "Well, yes, sir, two things." One, she says she's not checking out yet, and two, she wants you to know she adores you. And then we offered prayers that night because we thought that was the end, and then much to my surprise, and I think everybody else's, she rallied the next day, as some people do. And she made phone calls to friends and family throughout the day. And then by the end of that day and into the next, again, the decline had begun. And I'm sharing something with you only because it's pertinent to the story. Dora, a lot of us people were calling, family members were calling in, friends were calling in, but at that point she was not able to have those kinds of conversations. But a lot of relay was going back and forth. And Neil was there, Pierce, Neil's wonderful son, the president's and Barbara's grandson, some aides, Evan Sisley, who was medical aide. We were kind of all there watching through the day, but at some point the power went out, which was weird for our area. I'll be honest with you, I think the power never went out in our area because the president lived there, and it hardly ever went out, but it went out that day. And so, we had to kind of make adjustments that you would make at that moment. And it kind of confused us all. But we sat and read to Barbara throughout the day. And so I'm just going to bring you into the end. Now, keeping in mind that I was with Barbara through that whole afternoon until the time of her death. Her last word was home, H-O-M-E, okay? So we knew it was close, but did not know when it would be. Jean Becker called and said she had been talking with 43 and felt like we all needed to pray that if this was Bar's time, now was the time also to pray even more for a peaceful and timely death, not one that lingered for days. So I went downstairs, I went to the side garden of the house, and I prayed. I gave thanks for Bar's life and prayed that if it was the time, then let it be the time, a peaceful and painless death. Neil came out and joined me. He had been such a constant presence in Barbara's life, especially in these last years, and I could only imagine what he was feeling. I told him I was praying for our Lord to gently receive his mom. Neil did not want to see her leave, but he agreed that was the prayer needed at the time. We talked a bit, and then I went back inside. Given her steady decline and not waiting on the local power company to set things right, Evan and company decided to bring the president back downstairs. I only say that because the president was with her all day, but some of you will remember he was diagnosed with Parkinsonian syndrome, and it affected his mobility. And it was very important he had a daily massage to his legs to kind of keep the flow going. So he was only away for that little bit of time, but we knew it was getting close, and so moved him back into the room. And then I add, if I heard it once, I heard it 24 times as he sat there holding her hand throughout the day. He said, Bar, I love you, Bar, with such brazen passion and tenderness that it was palpable. At one point when she and I were together alone, he looked at me, gently smiled, pointed at her, and then he pointed toward heaven. Yes, sir, I said, that's where she'll be. At 5:30 p.m., the power was still out. By then, Bar's physician had arrived, and both he and Evan told everyone, we are there. If there's anything you want to say, now is the time to say it. Neil asked me to pray again. I anointed her head with a cross of oil. The president was holding her hand, as he had been all day. Everyone in the room, all of us, then knelt by her bed. Neil and Maria, Neil's wonderful wife, Pierce and Sarah Beth, his new wife, Evan, Neely, Marshall, other family members, and I, we all put our hands on her and again prayed the prayers we had prayed only a few nights before. Almighty God, look on this your servant lying in great weakness and comfort her with the promise of life everlasting. Into your hands, O merciful Savior, we commend your servant, Barbara. As we prayed, we wept and we held on to one another and we held Barbara. In my entire life, this was one of the few moments where the demonstrable presence of God was as real to me as the pages of the book you are now holding. When I finished with the Amen, everyone was weeping and telling Bar, I love you. The doctor was near and Bar took her final breath. She's gone, he whispered. And the president asked him to repeat it. She's gone to heaven, Mr. President. The Celtic Christians teach about something they call thin places. Thin places are those times and moments, people, and experiences that you have or encounter, and for whatever reason at that juncture, at that meeting point, the line between heaven and earth is so thin it's hardly detectable, if detectable at all. And I'll share a few of those thin places with you in this book, and here is one. At the moment the Bar's physician said a second time, she's gone to heaven, Mr. President, at that very moment, the lights, the power came back on. In that instant, we were all still kneeling, still all weeping. Maria lifted her head and looked at me and whispered, what does that mean? And I said, I don't know, but let's just take it for what it is. So now is the time for family and not for those of us who are not. So Evan, Neely, the doctor, and I left and closed the door. We were quietly standing in the hall outside the room. Pierce opened the door and said, Russ, he wants you to come in and pray again. So I came in and I knelt in front of the president and by Bar's body. And I placed their hands together, his on top of hers, and I put my hands around both of theirs. And I gave thanks for her life. I prayed that God would welcome one of his own. I
Prayed that God would comfort the president and all Barr left behind. I thank God for the love and witness of these two and this wonderful family. And when I finished, the president and I both were in tears. But while I was still on my knees, I took his face in my hands and I said, Mr. President, she is at peace now. She is in heaven. She's with her parents and your parents. And she's with your dear Robin, and you will see her again. And you, sir, will be okay. We will take care of you. We love you. I love you. I love you, he said. I kissed him on the cheek and I stepped back out of the room. It was up to that point the most intense moment in my ordained ministry. God was present and real and there in that moment. And Barbara was home. I don't want to take away from the fact that a friend of mine was leaving a cemetery one time and he saw on a tombstone the name of somebody and it said, he lived until he died. I think the two of them lived to the very last moment, and then I think when it came to an end, they began again. And that's something worth celebrating. So thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate the opportunity to be with you. I'll take Q&A. So I will tell you, my friends at Books A Million are here. It was a great sale last week because it was right before Father's Day. So I just looked at them and I said, what's 4th of July? Okay. So, but if you want me to sign them to you or to somebody you love, I'm happy to stick around. These folks have been wonderful and followed me around the country. And I'm really grateful to Books A Million for the part they've played because they're helping tell this great story. Any Q&A? If not, there's wine and cheese, but I'm happy to respond to any questions you may have. None? Thank you. Yeah, thank you. I finished before I was supposed to, which is a miraculous. Barbara would say that. Thank you all very much. I'm gonna hang out over here if you let them do business with you if you need to, but please stay for refreshments too. All right, I hope that.
This was fabulous.
Oh,
So,